think of a nicer place for a morning cup of coffee?
Rule number one is please don't get ahead of me. And rule number two is please don't get behind BJ, who will be bringing up the rear of the group. And the reason we ask you to stay between us is we kind of like to keep track of you. It's embarrassing when we come back with fewer people than we started with.
I was looking at a little video of this on YouTube yesterday, and this landslide looked huge.
Yes, it is, and it's surprising that it wasn't discovered until 10 years ago. How many of you have not been to the Tom's Thumb trailhead before? Great. This is a wonderful brand new trailhead, just opened a few weeks ago, and for many years there was a dirt parking area here used for decades by rock climbers. This trail in the landslide is named for Dr. Melvin Marcus, a geography professor at ASU. The landslide itself was discovered only 10 years ago by two grad students at ASU, Brian Guti and John Douglas. These two kids, because they were in their early 20s, persisted and kept on collecting data and finally persuaded a couple of geology profs to come out with them. And according to Brian, the dean of ASU geologists who came along on the hike got out there, looked it over, and took his hat off, threw it on the ground, and swore because he had missed it for 40 years.
But
the story of this part of the McDowell Mountains is really a story about granite rock, because that's what all of this rock is. It's granite. About 1.4 billion years ago, a huge mass of molten rock called magma welled up from the interior of the Earth toward the surface, but it was trapped underneath the existing layer of very hard metamorphic rock. And that magma, the molten rock, cooled deep underground very slowly. And that slow cooling probably took thousands or tens of thousands of years, allowed crystals to form and grow in the rock. And the result of that slow cooling of molten magma deep underground is this granite that we see here, about 1.4 billion years old. And if you look at the rock around here, and I've got a piece of it in my hand, but you can probably pick up pieces lying at your feet, you'll see the huge crystals in it. You'll see it's very rough, very coarse. It doesn't have big, smooth surfaces, doesn't have long, straight, sharp edges. Instead, it's kind of round, basically. It's randomly broken apart and eroded. And it's the way that granite erodes that causes the shapes that you see behind me, the shapes that you'll see on the mountain and around us as we hike further, and that really made the landslide possible. Now from here I'm going to point out to you three things that I'd like you to keep your eyes open for as we continue to hike. First of all, the shape right behind me, which generally people call mushrooms. And you'll see a lot of mushrooms as we walk, and 45 minutes or an hour from now, you'll get to examine one up close. The mushrooms reflect the unique way that granite erodes and is one of the contributing factors to why a landslide could happen in this kind of terrain. Second thing I'd like you to observe is up on the hillside directly above the mushrooms. If you notice, there are cracks in the rock, very obvious cracks. And if you notice, many of them are parallel to each other and they're running in this direction, in the direction my poles are. And then there are other cracks perpendicular to those longer ones, kind of running between them. And those cracks are called joints. And they are places where literally the solid rock is fractured and separated into pieces. And you can see the rock on that hillside is beginning to be divided into rectangular slabs, but lying at about a 45-degree angle. And that's something that's kind of unique to this part of the McDowells and also is part of the story of the landslide. The last thing I want to point out to you, it may be a little hard for some of you to see, but behind that very large collection of probably palo verdes up on the hillside, I don't know if you can see, there's kind of a rounded crack running on top of a bulge of rock. And it almost looks like a layer is going to peel off of that rock. And that's exactly what's going to happen if you came back in, 100,000 years. That's part of how granite erodes. It erodes typically in layers. That happens to be a very large layer. We're going to see many other layers being peeled off of the granite that's on the hillside. And that's also unique to granite and part of the story of the landslide.
The left side of the mushroom, way in back, you can see some climbers.
Oh, there they are.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, they don't even look like people. Oh, yeah, look. Oh. You did? Yeah, did a piece from this piece and the little thing that they
Typically call this pebbles or gravel or something like that. The official name for this kind of eroded granitic material is grus, G-R-U-S. And if you look at it, you'll notice that what you're looking at is mostly kind of milky white masses, which may have other things on them or in them. And occasionally you'll come across some pieces that are a little bit more clear than they are milky. And you'll see black flecks on some of the pieces. Those represent the three main components of granitic rock. If you see any clear crystals, those are quartz. The milky white crystals are a mineral called feldspar. The black flecks are biotite. And interestingly, these are all compounds of silicon, of the element silicon. These are all silicates, silicon and oxygen, sometimes with other elements mixed in. But silicon and oxygen together can assume many different crystalline structures. And the result is you can get hexagonal crystals, you can get rectangular crystals, you can get sheets and thin layers of this stuff. And we see all of these in granitic material. These components are really the key to how granite erodes. The black flecks called biotite are sheet silicates. The silicon and oxygen molecules are arranged in very thin, flat layers. So think of them when they're in the granite as being like a book whose covers are closed and you're holding them together. But when biotite gets wet and is exposed to water for extended periods of time, the pages of the biotite book spread open. One thing that happens when granite is exposed to extended periods of wetness, of water, is that the biotite component, which normally is very thin, flat sheets, expands into these kind of open structures, which begins to crack apart the other rock. The other thing that happens is that the second component, the feldspar, which is typically the largest white crystals, when it's exposed to water for extended periods of time, some of it, as it erodes, turns into clay. Now, when clay is dry, of course, it has structure, it can be shaped. What happens to clay when it gets wet? It gets slippery. So feldspar, when it's exposed to water for a long period of time, begins to erode, and the eroded material gets slippery and turns into, in effect, a lubricant. So now picture granite that is exposed to a lot of water over an extended period. And think about what's going on inside the erstwhile solid granite rock. The biotite books are opening and spreading apart, cracking things open, which means water can get further into the rock. Some of the feldspar exposed to the water is beginning to erode and dissolve and turn into a lubricant, which makes it easier for things to break apart. By the way, some pieces of granite, particularly if you find protruding edges of this very coarse-grained granite with the big crystals in it, that you can often break it apart in your hands. It's that easily eroded. And the stuff under our feet and the stuff along the trail that we're hiking on is all eroded granitic material, and this stuff erodes quite rapidly. The other characteristic of eroding granite is it doesn't have any internal structure to it. It's the crystals, when it first formed deep underground, kind of grow randomly. So as the pieces erode and separate, they don't have any preferred direction of splitting or of eroding. They erode randomly in all directions, and random processes often result in rounded shapes. And so another characteristic of granitic rock is rounded shapes, rounded edges, and this is called spheroidal, as in sphere, spheroidal erosion. And you'll notice that an awful lot of the boulders we're walking through have these rounded shapes versus, remember the samples I passed around a little bit ago of the rock from elsewhere in the preserve, not rounded at all, but rather flat surfaces, straight edges, sharp angles. You tend not to see that on granitic rock. So it's kind of a giveaway. If you see something that's got big crystals in it, coarse-grained and rounded, the odds are you're looking at granite as you are here. Okay, the next stop is
picture frames around town. If you stand in front of the picture frame, you see a thing.
They're very curious. They would come up.
This is obviously one of the mushroom shapes like you saw early on, and we can walk around this. But I wanted to show you the erosion processes in action, because, you know, here it is. The key to granite erosion was exposure to water. Where would you expect a rock to have more exposure for longer periods of time to water? Above ground or below ground?
Below ground.
Below ground, yeah, away from the sun. It doesn't evaporate as fast. The water soaks in a bit and will stay in the ground for much longer than it will stay on the surface. On the surface, it can roll away, flow away due to the terrain and gravity. It can evaporate due to the sunlight and the very low humidity, whereas underground, the water can last somewhat longer. It will eventually evaporate underground, but it takes quite a bit longer. Whatever water there is will stay around longer underground. Given that, where would you expect erosion to be faster, above ground or below ground?
Below ground. But
below ground, because it's all about the water, basically. So, here's a mushroom. What part of it was above ground?
The wide part.
And what part of it has been below ground a lot, even though it's above ground now?
The stem.
The narrower portion underneath. So, a mushroom, one thing the mushroom tells us, if we knew the rate of erosion in the surface material, which our guess is it's an inch every 5 or 10 years. This portion from about there down has been below ground for probably thousands of years in more saturated condition, and therefore the biotite's been splitting, the feldspar's been eroding and lubricating, and the result is we get these narrow necks. So one of the things that this means is when you look at boulders sitting on a hillside, you're looking, of course, at the top portion, the portion that's exposed to the air. You're not seeing what's underground. And often what's underground will be much less substantial than what's exposed at the surface. So some of these huge boulders, in effect, may not be anchored very well into the ground around them. Also, remember what happens when this stuff erodes. It turns into what we're standing on. It turns into gravel or sand, sometimes known on steep slopes as ball bearings. If you've ever walked on it or hiked on it, uphill or downhill, this kind of stuff can be slippery because it's small, somewhat rounded pieces that can easily move and slide on each other. And when they get wet, they get even slipperier because of that feldspar, that clay that's mixed in. So this narrower, eroded portion almost surely is surrounded by the small material, this grus, which can be, under certain conditions, very slippery. And those conditions actually exist right around here. There's a crack, big crack down at the bottom. There's another crack right here, which, by the way, is the narrowest portion. This stuff up here, you see these cracks up here? This is spalling. Remember the peeling away that I showed you earlier? Well, that's what this is, and this may cause a layer of this stuff to come off, but it probably isn't going to cause the mushroom itself to fall over, but some of these lower cracks might. The last thing I'd like to point out to you, and if you have good eyes, you'll see this a lot. Notice this rock here, different type of rock. Smooth, flat, darker. This kind of rock is called a xenolith. Xeno as in xenophobia, it means strange or alien, and lith meaning rock. This, by the way, is Greek. The geologists got there before the botanists did, so they used Greek, and the botanists were left with Latin. This is a xenolith, a strange rock, a foreign rock. It's the rock that was here first. It's the rock that was here already, probably metamorphic rock. When the magma welled up around it, got caught, the magma cooled, and that rock survived being surrounded by 2,000 degree Fahrenheit molten rock. So it is a remnant rock, and it's very interesting to a geologist because it tells them what was there before this stuff got there. And if you look carefully as we keep hiking, especially if you go up onto the landslide with me, you'll see these xenoliths embedded fairly commonly in some of the granite boulders we'll go past. So if you want to...
It's so interesting. How long.
Okay, the landslide is what's stretching out behind me in both directions, about a half a mile each way. That is the rock that came down off the mountains. So now let's talk about how it happened by adding up some factors that I pointed out to you. The most important factor is the way that granite erodes, where it splits, and the fact that some of the granitic material turns into clay and gets slippery when it's wet. The fact that granite that's underground for long periods of time and exposed to water may be much less substantial than what's on the surface, and so some of these large boulders we see are not well anchored. Right now, this is the Sonoran Desert, and it's been this way for thousands of years. Average rainfall out here it's probably 11 or 12 inches. So there really isn't enough saturated soil here for long enough to explain a major landslide. When might there have been enough water here?
During an ice age.
During an ice age. The most recent series of ice ages started about 2 million years ago and ended about 10,000 years ago. We never had glaciers here. If anybody tells you that the mountains were carved by glaciers, they're wrong. But some of the mountains might well have been shaped in part by what we did get here during the ice ages, which was lots more rain than we do today, and freezing temperatures. And so we had enough rain to saturate the soil and cold enough temperatures in the winter so we had some of the freeze-thaw cycle where, as you probably know, if any of you have ever had to contend with ice on your roofs elsewhere, when water freezes, it actually expands, a very unusual property of water. And when it heats up and melts, it contracts. And so we get tremendously powerful expansion and contraction of freezing water in crevices and underneath the shingles on our roof or our eaves if we're in those climates. So during one of the last ice ages, the last series of ice ages, there was water, there was freezing and thawing, helping to erode and split apart the rock. Now, a second factor. Remember those joints I showed you when we stopped first? And they are cracks in the solid rock, places where the rock is separating. So you can imagine that as erosion proceeds, places that are already cracked are going to get more water. They're going to split apart more readily than places that are still somewhat more solid. And so the existence of those joints all running in parallel to each other means that there is a surface that will erode more quickly and could preferentially separate from whatever it's lying on. So the rock above a joint is sitting on, if you will, a natural ski run down a hillside. And under the right conditions, those joints are a perfect place for sliding to occur. Another thing that should be very obvious to you as you look up on the hillside is it's steep up there. And we're looking at it post the landslide. Before the landslide, as near as we can figure, the angle of the mountainside was about a 45-degree angle. Now what happens when rock breaks off? It slides down. And when some rock begins to slide down, it can knock into other rocks, which the underground portion is not substantial, the surroundings are slippery, there's a joint underneath anyway, that's still on a steep hillside, so one rock begets another rock, begets, etc., and we end up with a landslide. Geologists think that what we're seeing behind me happened about 500,000 years ago, but that is a very crude estimate based on some very indirect methods of dating, and we would love to be able to do enough research to really figure it out. But the current estimate is 500,000 years ago, which was during an earlier pulse of the Ice Age. So it all kind of fits together. Let me give you some statistics. 194 million cubic feet of rock, weighing 10 million tons. The landslide is about a mile long, 1,500 feet wide, and 100 to 200 feet thick. Was probably all over in a minute or two, which means the rock was moving between 30 and 60 miles an hour. And you would not want to have been here. One of the crucial ingredients, namely saturated ground and to some extent freeze-thaw, doesn't occur today. But all of the other factors, steep joints, granitic rock, steep slopes, still exist in many parts of North Scottsdale and surrounding area. And I'm not sure everyone will be able to see, but we'll do our best. Okay. How is it possible that some of these enormous boulders, by the way, the biggest of which is about 33 feet in diameter and weighs by itself thousands of tons, matrix material, acted like a sheet of oil, allowing these boulders to slide across the desert floor for about a mile. And that's unusual. It only happens in granitic landslides that have occurred in saturated conditions. And it causes this to be a very special kind of landslide that actually has its own name. It's a German name, and I'll let you Google it because I can't pronounce it. But there aren't very many in the world, and they're studied pretty carefully. And the lubricant material is visible right here, and not everybody can see this, but at my feet are some mounds of reddish mud-like material with little pieces and bits of rock embedded in them, and they're up here mostly on the hillside. There's a little bit of it. This is granite I'm stepping on. This is matrix material at the end of my pole down here. The reddish color is iron, tiny, tiny bits of iron that have oxidized, rusted, and created this coloration. Also, you'll notice at the bases of some of the boulders that we wend our way through, you'll actually see some of this reddish kind of clay-like material at the bottom. Matrix material, it's what the rocks slid out on. And it's really unusual to be able to see it preserved so well here, and it's what gave us this unusual landslide.
This is my work for getting my health back.
Geologists are pretty sure that the highest point in the McDowells is someplace under our feet, because we think that the highest point in the McDowells, which today is East End Mountain at about 40, not quite 4,100 feet, we think that the original ridgeline behind me was higher than that, but came down in the slide. If you look at the ridgeline, you'll see that U-shaped dip at the bottom. Near the bottom of that U-shaped depression, there's some small pinnacles sticking up. There's 2 or 3 of them, I think. So that U-shaped depression used to be higher, and that's where the slide came from. It came down from the area more or less between the 2 peaks, higher points on either side of the U. So it came down between those 2, and it came down about halfway down to where we are. And in fact, I'm going to point, it will be hard for you to see, but if you look about halfway down and just let your eye sort of scan horizontally from there, that's kind of the bottom of the area that broke away from the mountainside. If you look at a diagram of that mountainside today, what you'll see is there's still a very steep slope, but the bottom of that slope, there's a slight curve. It's a little less steep, and that area at the bottom, and we're looking, that horizontal line of rocks is the edge of that bottom area. It's called the pocket. And what geologists think happened is that the original hillside or mountainside there that went up higher than the existing dip that we're seeing, broke off, kind of bounced off of that slightly less steep pocket at the bottom, like a ski jump, took a flyer down this 300 or 400 feet that's above us called the fall zone, and from there, starting just 500 feet west of behind me, is where the rock began to slide out in the desert. And as you've walked on the trail, and as you'll walk from here on, you'll see the extent of this slide mass, this area of sliding rock, and it's really pretty impressive when you look at it extending outward. Now, we think it happened hundreds of thousands of years ago, but if you look at the mountainside to the south of that area, you'll see several places where there are pretty significant piles of nice, fresh-looking rocks. And that's a long way from us. This is hundreds of tons of boulders, and these are geologically recent landslides. So even though there's not nearly as much water today to saturate the ground, to freeze and thaw, and so forth, we know that landslides are still possible, perhaps on a smaller scale, because we can see them on the hillside. And the fact that the rocks are light colored, are visibly lighter than what's around them. A lot of the dark coloration is lichen growing or desert varnish, and those things take typically from hundreds to a few thousand years to mature. So the rocks get darker over a period of a few centuries to a few millennia, and the fact that some of those rocks in those small landslides up there are still so light in color means that they are more recent than that. So possibly within what we would think of as recorded history. We've come about halfway down the slide mass, and the rest of it is extending out to the east toward Four Peaks from here. And you can pretty clearly see where it stops, because it's where the large boulders stop. And beyond that, you're looking at open desert scrub. There aren't the collection of large boulders that you see on the slide mass. You can see it extends another third of a mile. We're actually very close to the boundary here of the preserve, and the open land to our east is McDowell Mountain Regional Park. It's 20,000 acres of land. The preserve, if the land acquisition plan for later this month is successful, will be about 27,000 acres, and it will connect to Tonto National Forest, which is millions of acres, and so we will have one of the largest urban open areas in the country available to us. And because if we can make the connection to Tonto in this next land purchase, it will be ecologically sustainable. And that's the key, because the ecology requires not just the plants, not just the climate, requires a full animal population, including large mammals, and they need range, and Tonto gives them range. And this is a wonderful vista to the east. Most of you, I'm sure, are familiar with Four Peaks, which is right behind me. Four Peaks is a layer cake. It has several layers in it. So look at the peaks of Four Peaks and describe them to me. What do you see? They're jagged. If the sun were shining on them, you'd see they have edges. So what kind of rock does that remind you of? Metamorphics, not granite rock. Remember, metamorphic rock was the rock elsewhere in the McDowells that has edges and flat surfaces and stuff like that. Very different from granite. And in fact, the top of Four Peaks is that 1.7 billion year old original metamorphic rock. It happens to be quartzite, which is metamorphic sandstone. It's a very, very brittle, hard rock, slow to erode. Now describe the bottom portion of Four Peaks. What do you see? Rounded, not sharp rock. It's granite rock. So Four Peaks shows us the layers in the order in which they formed, where the metamorphic rock was the oldest. It formed from rock that came from the surface and was carried down, and the granite rock came from magma that came from the interior and flowed up underneath. And so the original layers were younger granite below older metamorphic rock. Here in the McDowells, what's happened is these layers have been tilted on their side. The western portion of the McDowells has the older metamorphic rock that was on top, and what's exposed here in the eastern McDowells is the somewhat younger granite that originally and still in Four Peaks was underneath. And it's because these two layers have been tilted on their side, probably during the period when these mountains were formed, which geologically was quite recent, between 2 and 20 million years ago. The other thing I wanted to point out to you, at the far right edge of your field of vision, to the south, that is Superstition Mountain, which, if any of you have been out to Apache Junction, is the mountain that looms up over AJ. And some of you can see just to the left of that the distinctive pinnacle, which is what?
Weaver's Needle.
Weaver's Needle. The Superstition Mountains, which now Four Peaks is not part of the Superstitions. Four Peaks is the southern end of the Mazatzel mountain range that extends all the way to the north as far as we can see. The Superstitions extend mostly eastward from Superstition Mountain, and the Superstitions are a 15 to 25 million year old field of volcanoes. We had volcanoes right here in River City. The Supes were volcanic for millions of years, and in fact what you're looking at are the rims of what are called volcanic caldera, which are circular features caused by the collapse of a volcanic field when the gas and magma pressure from underneath turns off. So volcanic fields that were there collapsed, 3, 4, or 5 large caldera, edges of which form what today we call the Superstition Mountains. Superstition Mountain itself, near Apache Junction, is the edge of a 10-mile diameter volcanic caldera. Now, we used to think that Weaver's Needle was the plug from the neck of a volcano. And today, geologists have decided that that's not what it is, that it's a hoodoo, like in Chiricahua National Monument, that it's an eroded feature from volcanic material, probably softer volcanic material that's capped by harder material on top, and it's created this pinnacle. You can see this in Chiricahua National Monument from a different source, different cause. You can see it in Bryce Canyon, Zion, etc., etc. So that's what the Superstition Mountains are. They're volcanic. And when you go back to the Tom's Thumb trailhead, if you go into the pavilion, you'll see some signs there. And if you look to the north, you can't see it from here, there's a mountain in the northern Scottsdale area, and part of the preserve, which we will begin hiking to in about a year, that is not a volcano, but a layer cake of volcanic material. Some of it is lava flows, solidified lava flows. Some of it is volcanic ash that was blown off in explosive eruptions, but all the material out there came from the Superstitions, a long way off. So it shows you the magnitude of the volcanic activity in the area.
You know, replaced it with one express of poor or poorer service. You know, felt those trips.
You know, Mesa would become a more progressive place than Scottsdale.
Look at some of the rock that runs right up to the trail. here, you'll see it looks different than the granite that we've been seeing. It actually is originally granitic rock. This is what's called a shear zone. And this is an area where rock was either compressed or pulled apart by tectonic forces. And in response to the force being applied to the rock, the granitic rock actually formed layers. And some of this rock is foliated, again, like the pages of a book. And you can see that some of the rock has gotten parallel cracks in it. And that's in response to the pressure that it was under. What's interesting about this shear zone, we actually walked over 25 yards or 50 yards back more of this rock. The shear zone is probably 50 or 100 yards wide, and it runs straight about 2 miles in each direction. And in fact, if you look up the hillside directly here, and if you look in the middle of that hillside, you'll notice that it looks different than the rock on either side of it. And what's running up the middle of that slope is this layered, distorted rock. And the shear zone runs all the way up to the ridgeline, interestingly, tantalizingly close to the top of the landslide breakaway zone and over the mountains. And we can find this same kind of rock exposed on some of the trails on the other side of the mountains. So we know that this zone runs for miles, and it's all, if you look at the rock that's exposed in different places, it's all lined up in exactly the same direction, and it's all the same kind of rock. We don't know exactly when it happened, but the fact that it's straight rather than twisted and distorted probably means that it happened during or at the very end of the formation of the mountains. If it had happened earlier, the mountains being lifted and folded probably would have caused this zone to be bent and twisted, and it's not. So if you hike on other trails in the preserve, you'll see some places where the rock looks like pages of a book slightly opened. It's called foliated, and it is depending. There are several shear zones, but it might well be the same zone of rock that's run from 2 miles in that direction and goes at least a couple miles in that direction. How many of you have spent at least $1 in Scottsdale? In that case, you own a tiny piece of the preserve, because this is paid for with a little increment from sales tax collected in the city of Scottsdale. So all of us who spend money in Scottsdale are contributing to purchasing and protecting this land. If you bought a car, thank you very much. You own a rock.